John Coski. He is our Director of Historical Research and Publications for the American Civil War Museum. I don't think that he would be especially offended if I told you that he has been with the museum forever. He can elaborate a bit more on that. But without further ado, John Coski.
Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you, Patrick. I think I can see the screen from here. I had not sent to Patrick my introduction, so the one thing I need to add to that, just for my bona fides for this program, is that a book that I wrote 11 years ago, which seems like yesterday, which goes along with what Patrick said about being at the museum forever, when 2005 is like yesterday, but a book called The Confederate Battle Flag, America's Most Embattled Emblem, which was based in turn on an exhibit that we did at the Museum of the Confederacy back in 1993. So what I'm doing today is a talk tailored to the occasion, that is Civil War Emancipation Day, particularly examining the events immediately after the war about the history of the Confederate battle flag. So let me start out. This, of course, the furling of the flags at Appomattox, a famous painting now at West Point. Shortly after the surrender of the armies, both at Appomattox, at Greensboro, and elsewhere, in April and May of 1865, Father Abram Ryan, the poet-priest of the Confederacy, wrote a poem called The Conquered Banner. Its closing lines urged Southerners to furl that banner softly, slowly, treat it gently, it is holy, for it droops above the dead. Touch it not, unfold it never, let it droop there, furled forever, for its people's hopes are dead. Now, Father Ryan's poem was incredibly popular. It was even set to music, as this sheet music testifies. It obviously captured the mood, the temper of white Southerners in the era immediately after the war. But did white Southerners, in fact, heed Father Ryan's poetical advice? Did they furl their Confederate flags once and for all, treat them as holy relics of a revered but defeated cause? I think we all know the answer to that question. If the answer were yes, we wouldn't have this cover on Style magazine a couple of years ago. We wouldn't still be fighting over the Confederate flag 151 years after the end of the war. And since today's theme is the period immediately after the war, what I want to cover today in very broad strokes and in 15 minutes is the fate of the Confederate flag in the years immediately after the war and the decades immediately after the war. But first of all, I need to offer something of a caveat and clarification about the terminology I'm going to use. I'm going to say Confederate flag, I'm going to say Confederate battle flag. I'm assuming this is a pointer here, or is it sometime? Even if it's not, let's see. Is there one on this? Try not to press any button that I'll regret. But anyway, so what you see here is that this is from a 1907 report of the United Confederate Veterans on the official flags of the Confederacy. The Confederate flag that I'm talking about, of course, is any variation of that old star-studded blue cross on a red field in whatever shape and size. That's what we call the Confederate flag or the Confederate battle flag. But the fact is, it was never by itself the Confederate flag, although then in the second level, the second row, you will see the second and third national flags of the Confederacy, which obviously featured that symbol we know as the Confederate flag. It was not what was called the Stars and Bars. That's what you see up in the upper left. That's the first national flag of the Confederacy. The Confederate battle flag, designated as the Confederate battle flag by the United Confederate Veterans, is in the upper right, that square pattern. But the fact is that these all distort the flag history of the Confederacy, which was incredibly diverse. We somehow, encouraged by the United Confederate Veterans themselves in the early 20th century, in the 20th and 21st century, have reduced the enormous complexity and diversity of Confederate flags into the Stars and Bars and the Confederate battle flag. So my caveat is that I am willfully, consciously oversimplifying and distorting the diversity of Confederate flag history, because what we're talking about is the symbolism of the flag that has that blue cross on the red field. Long caveat, short story. So let's get back to the period immediately after the war. We need to ask ourselves, to get in this frame of mind, what we would expect to happen to the flags of a defeated nation in a civil war, and like it or not, the people who won the war considered it a civil war, so let's not quibble over that defense. The fact is the Confederacy never was recognized by the United States or formally recognized by any nation in the world, and it lost the war. So those who revere the flag, then and now, would want to believe that the symbols should be accepted and revered for the future. It makes sense, it's natural, but it's understandable. But what typically happens to the symbols of a defeated nation in a civil war? Well, let's kind of take a look at history. We know that after a nation loses a civil war, heads roll. Leaders are executed. Sometimes the masses of people are executed. They're dispossessed of their property. Their symbols are repressed. Their version of history is repressed. We're all familiar with the axiom that the winners write the history. And to some degree, this happened in the Confederacy and the Confederate experience. The execution of the Lincoln conspirators immediately after the war, the execution of Henry Wirz, the commandant of the Andersonville prison camp, the 2-year imprisonment of President Jefferson Davis, and the shorter imprisonment of other officers of the Confederate cabinet. The publication of very stridently pro-Northern versions of history in the immediate years after the war. And there were also regulations governing the display of Confederate insignia. If you wanted to wear your old uniform around because it was the heaviest coat you had to take off the brass buttons and the insignia if you wanted to continue to wear your uniforms. It would make sense that Confederate flags would similarly be the topic of orders by the U.S. military in the occupied South. From what I can tell, however, there were no such orders. Cannot find anyone, and no one else has been able to find them either. But instead, what seems to have been the case is kind of a common understanding. After you've lost the Civil War, it's probably not a good idea to go displaying the national flags of the defeated nation and the battle flags of the defeated armies. It was an understanding. And this is best illustrated by one of these tempest in a teacup incidents that occurred in Rome, Georgia, immediately after the war in February 1867, so a couple of years after the war, when some former Confederates displayed Confederate battle flags as part of a memorial tableau in a church in Rome, Georgia. And the local commander had those men arrested. And it became a kind of a cause célèbre in the newspapers. And generally the reaction to it was, in the South, how dare they interfere with our commemoration of our heroes? And the North was the audacity of those people to go displaying these flags of the defeated nation. But for the most part, Southerners resented this, but they understood it. And that seems to have been the case throughout Reconstruction, which was not as long as you might think. It didn't last till 1876 in most places, but it was over by 1870. In the following year, in 1868, brought a spate of reports of the unfurling of flags in public in the South, mostly at Democratic Party rallies. The New Orleans Republican newspaper reported the flag was hung out of a window as a Democratic procession passed by, leading to all kinds of ecstatic shouts and salutes. It is sad to believe that this city, at this late day, contains any one person so unmitigatedly foolish as to commit such an absurdity to still follow the phantom of a bloody past, editorialized this Republican newspaper. 1868 was, of course, a presidential election year. And the display of the Confederate flag that year was akin to the famous bloody shirt, associating the Democratic Party with the Confederacy, with treason, and with the deaths of more than 360,000 Northern men at the hands of Southern soldiers carrying that battle flag. So that was the status of the battle flag during Reconstruction, one of these symbols of treason and akin to the bloody shirt. But despite this political pressure, in fact, I meant to go to Thomas Colley long ago. I don't have any slides for this section, so I'm giving you a slide of a Confederate veteran, 1st Virginia Cavalry, who lost his foot in the war, with his regiment's battle flag in the 1890s, which he then gave to the Confederate Museum. So Thomas Colley will be your shepherd through this section of my talk. Despite the pressure not to display the flag, Confederates, former white Southerners, former Confederates, occasionally did so during Reconstruction, especially after most states re-entered the Union by 1870. Most of the credible reports of Confederate flag use were memorial in nature. like the memorial tableau in Rome, Georgia. Residents of New Bern, North Carolina in 1867 placed Confederate national flags and the battle flag and a Bible and pictures of Lee and Davis and Joseph Johnston in the cornerstone of a vault to hold the remains of Confederate dead. That was a typical scenario. And they were displayed here in Richmond at Hollywood Cemetery in 1875 at the funeral of General George Pickett, of Pickett's Charge fame. And also at Hollywood, here's the famous pyramid erected in 1869, one of the first monuments to Confederate dead in the Confederacy. So the memorial use of the flag was consistent with Confederate memorialization generally, and monuments generally, which were first erected in cemeteries where Confederate dead were buried. A kind of consensus evolved that whatever you might think of the Confederate cause, you could respect the Confederate soldiers who fought and died for that cause. But even before the end of Reconstruction, Confederate flags came out from behind the sacred space of cemetery walls. In South Carolina's contentious gubernatorial election in 1876, when Wade Hampton was elected, the groups like the Carolina Rifle Club, one of the paramilitary groups who backed the redemption of South Carolina from Union rule, carried their old Confederate flag, specifically that battle flag of the 10th South Carolina Infantry. In other words, a decade after the war, a little more than a decade after the war, the Confederate battle flag once again became a political symbol in a highly charged election for the redemption of South Carolina. Most of the time, though, you saw, beginning in the 1890s, this was a typical scenario for the display of the Confederate battle flag. In the 1890s, the Confederate heritage groups that we know today, the United Confederate Veterans, that's not around anymore, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans were organized. And all kinds of local memorial organizations began erecting monuments, not just in cemeteries anymore, but on public squares, places like Monument Avenue. Here's the Jeb Stuart statue, dedicated, unveiled in 1907. And battle flags were used often in those dedications. In the public sphere, in the public, the most visible and powerful public spaces. They were part of this evolving ritual for memorializing the Confederacy, its martyrs, and its heroes. So from this point, 1890s, and really until about 1948, the flag when the flag emerged as something different that I'll get to momentarily, the Confederate battle flag was very much a part of Southern life, but in very restricted kinds of ways that you can understand, that were associated with memorializing the Confederate dead and Confederate heroes and the Confederate cause. It was visible at monument unveilings, United Confederate Veterans reunions and parades through the streets of Richmond and other cities, and at meetings of those Confederate heritage organizations. Now, was there ever any backlash? Was there ever any opposition to this? Well, not officially by the U.S. government nor the U.S. Army. And there were no more incidents after Reconstruction about like what happened in Rome, Georgia, with the Army throwing in jail those who tried to display the flag. But there was protest. Here's the human battle flag at the Lee Monument during their Veterans Reunion in 1907 in Richmond. When the Lee Monument, shown here 17 years later, was unveiled in 1907, John Mitchell Jr., the African-American editor and also last African-American councilman in Richmond, the editor of the Richmond Planet, complained that rebel flags were everywhere displayed and long lines of Confederate veterans told in no uncertain tones that they still clung to the theories which were presumably to be buried for all eternity. The Confederacy and its flags were associated with treason and a return to the bad old days, as well as a kind of a racial and political division. Now, this is the image most of us have of reunions between North and South, the shaking hands over the bloody chasm, or in this case, the stone wall at Gettysburg for the 50th anniversary reunion in 1913. We think about the reconciliation between North and South, but I think a lot of you have heard that reconciliation may not be the most accurate term to describe what happened between Northern and Southern veterans. They continued to disagree about the causes of the war, who was right and who was wrong, and they also disagreed about the Confederate battle flag. not a reunion or a joint reunion, which were few and far between, went by, even into the 1938 75th anniversary of Gettysburg, went by without Union veterans complaining about the display of the Confederate battle flag. Many soldiers saying, I'm not going to go down there if those rebels are going to be able to hang out their treasonous banner. So it was not all sweetness and light regarding the battle flag. So Union veterans continued to complain about the display of the Confederate battle flag. Many didn't attend these reunions. Many had to be talked into it by their commanders and their state governors. But on the whole, white Southerners were able to unfurl and use battle flags and flags generally without official or mass opposition, just as they were able to erect monuments in public spaces to their heroes, write their own very pro-Confederate histories of the war, and, not coincidentally, able to impose a new racial order based on Jim Crow segregation, which, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized and affirmed in 1896. But throughout this era, the Confederate heritage organizations essentially owned their flags and their meanings. But this began to change. This is a photograph from a demonstration of an automobile driving from New York City to Daytona, Florida in 1907, and hard to see because it's bad photocopy. U.S. flag and a Confederate battle flag, not the stars and bars, but a battle flag on the front of this car in 1907 to connote North and South. What it tells us is that the Confederate flag was becoming, by this point, a symbol not of the Confederacy, not of the Confederate army or soldier, but of a symbol, boom, yeah, must be my time must be up. They really mean it. And thank you all for coming to this talk when you could be out enjoying the firing of an artillery piece. See what you missed? But it was a more general symbol of the South, which points to what the flag has become in our own lifetimes. And I really don't have time to go into that. But it became a symbol more generically of the South in the hands of U.S. Army U.S. Army soldiers who hailed from the South, who made it a totem of their Southernness in the era of World War II in particular, and also college football fans, not just Ole Miss and other schools with which we related most strongly. This is University of Virginia in 1947 when UVA played Penn. We need something to show that we're Southern. The last time a bunch of Virginia boys marched into Pennsylvania, what did they bring with them? Oh, yeah. And they actually won this time, 47-0 against Penn. But this was the fate of the flag in the mid-20th century, as well as this. The flag became, in the mid-40s, a flag symbol very explicitly and purposely of racism, of the Ku Klux Klan, of a political symbol in the Dixiecrats in the 1948 election, which is why 1948 is such an important demarcation line in the history of the battle flag, and of this, the commercialism that many of us grew up with in the South, where the flag was God knows what. It was a Southern symbol, but it was also, as people complained, confetti in careless hands. And it is for that reason, the flag was kept alive and became transformed in that era. And essentially, those who had owned it for that long period, from the end of Reconstruction into the 1940s, predictably, and against their will, they fought hard, the United Daughters in particular. They lost control of this flag and its symbol in the 1940s and especially in the 1950s. And the result, of course, are the controversies that began immediately in the late 1940s and especially in the 1960s and have been with us to this day, witnessed the events of Charleston in the aftermath of the Charleston murders last year. This is nothing new. These controversies have been occurring consistently for a half of a century. There's a lot more I could say about this, but of course our focus is on the period right after the war, and my time is almost up. So let me conclude with the obvious. The flags may have been furled at Appomattox, and despite Father Ryan's advice to the contrary, the battle flag was not furled forever. The people who revered it kept it alive as a symbol for the Confederate dead and of the Confederate cause. But in keeping it alive for whatever reason, it meant that it was around for any kind of use, or if you will, misuse and abuse. What did not happen to the Confederate flag in 1865, what did not happen to it, that it wasn't furled, is, for my money, the most important single non-event in its 155-year history. Thank you very much for your attention. And I guess I have some time for questions if there are any. Please, sir. Yeah.
South. Historically, does the defeated army's flag disappear in its entirety?
Yeah. Historically, does the flag of the losing side disappear in its entirety? As a rule, yes. At least during the generation or two afterwards, when the wound still bleeds, so to speak. There's a recent book on comparing, oddly enough, the U.S. Civil War, the aftermath and the memory of the American Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War. Two different times, 1930s, 1860s, and to me that makes the book kind of odd. But the bottom line of that book is that Franco, of course, repressed entirely, not only executed a lot of people, but repressed entirely the nationalist cause and all their symbols, even their graves. It was very difficult for the veterans, the people who fought, and people disappeared in that war, as they disappeared in so many civil wars, and were never to be heard from again. And it wasn't until after Franco's death, 40 years later, 35, 40 years later, that people were able to even mention the dead. So it's not only that the symbols disappeared, people disappeared. And there has been, however, in more recent years, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you will, similar to the model that is so emulated today about what has happened in South Africa and how to get over the scars of the past, how to cope with the scars of the past. But so several generations later, the losing symbols have been resurrected, and through a very cathartic kind of process. The analogy that everyone wants to bring up, of course, is that of the swastika. And it's, in my experience, it's such a toxic one that I avoid it, not because there aren't things to be learned from it, but because people don't think straight. When you compare a Confederate flag to a swastika and Southerners to Nazis, it tends to generate a lot more heat than light. But it's instructive, once again, in what didn't happen. So people always, and this, of course, is becoming more relevant today. We're going to be hearing a lot more of it because, predictably, the conversation has turned from just flags to monuments as well. So why do we have all these monuments? Why were they allowed to erect these things? But the fact was the White South was able to continue to use its flag and to erect monuments. And 75 or 100 and more years of having those monuments and having that free flag use means that there are generations invested in these things that have little to do with the Civil War, really. It's just your own personal heritage. If you went to Douglas Southall Freeman High School and you were able to call yourself the Lee Davis Confederates, it's about your school heritage more than it is about the heritage of the Confederacy. So you have a lot of people invested in it. But a lot of people who are critical of the flag and critical of monuments are asking, why wasn't it repressed just like the swastika was? Well, I'm a realist. It wasn't. For whatever reason, it wasn't. Whether because the U.S. government, in the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, wanted to let him up easy, that famous quote among his last conversations before he was assassinated, let them up easy, and not to repress them, not to send people to re-education camps to unlearn what they had learned about the Confederacy. That was the option not taken. And for whatever reason, this nation allowed the losers to retain their own history and to retain their own symbols. 150 years later, that simple fact explains all the angst that we in Richmond especially are going through. If you wish that we weren't going through angst, if you wish there weren't all this constantly fighting over our history, or if you want to retain Confederate symbols, or you wish that these things at Monument Avenue never happened, well, the fact is they're there, and we're still trying to grapple with the implications that this country, for whatever reason, noble or ignoble, allowed the defeated side to revere its heritage and its heroes. Long answer to a short question. Are there any others? Okay. Thank you all very much.